Hi everyone, hope all is well. So today we're going to be looking at what's called the federalism versus anti-federalism debate, which is a really interesting episode in the history of American politics. Basically, it represents, you could say, the very interesting and foundational debate in American history that kind of shaped or structured the American government as we know it today. I take it you guys received some primary texts which you guys were assigned to analyze. So what I'm going to present here today is going to hopefully help you do that, right? So I'm going to do several things here with a view to that. So the plan is as follows. So we're going to first look at the objectives of today's lesson, and then I'm going to deal with some preliminaries, which I'll introduce in a moment, and then I'm going to leave you with some guiding questions to sort of think about as you work on the assignment. And also I'm going to sort of put forward to you a kind of bonus question which you could do for extra marks or something like that. Alright, so on to the objectives first. Okay, so the lesson objectives are as follows. There are 3 in number. The first is hopefully by the end of today and the end of your assignment, more specifically, you'll be able to clearly distinguish between the federalist and anti-federalist perspectives, right, with regard to that debate. The second is to understand the anti-federalists' concern about centralized government and individual liberties via primary text analysis, right, and this could be the most important one. And then finally, be able to evaluate the relevance of anti-federalist arguments in contemporary discussions about government power, right, wherever you might think they're applicable. This is sort of the application part of the knowledge acquisition. Okay, so to help you to be able to do that, I want to introduce some preliminaries, okay? And these are 2 in number. The first one is a very useful philosophical tool that I think that can be helpful to you, not only with respect to this assignment, but just more generally, actually. I think that if you understand it well, it can help you with any task or assignment or activity that involves some kind of persuasive speech or persuading someone, trying to sort of understand what they're saying and being able to assess it. Okay, so that's the first thing preliminary I want to introduce to you guys. The second is just a bit of context setting to the readings that you guys are going to do and analyze, just to sort of give you some background knowledge as to why the authors that you're going to be reading say the things that they say, right? Because obviously they are not writing in a vacuum, right? There's a whole sort of background context to it that's historical and intellectual. Okay, so we're going to get to that too. Okay, but the useful philosophical tool first. Okay, so what is that? Basically, it's a distinction between 2 kinds of knowledge, right? 2 categories under which actually everything that we know or everything that we take ourselves to know fall, right? That whatever it is that we know falls into, you'll see that it falls into one of these 2 categories. right? And you could try this yourself. The first category is what I'm calling conceptual knowledge. Okay, this is basically the idea that you understand the meaning of the term or the concept that you're being asked to sort of consider, right? So here's a simple example from an everyday context, right? If someone uses a certain word like, I don't know, cat, right? I have a cat, so my cat comes to mind. You understand what the word means, okay? In other words, you have a conception of that word, okay? Basically, conception has to do with defining or describing some term or idea, right? Either to yourself or to someone else in order for them to grasp some meaning from it, okay? A lot of what we know is this sort of conceptual knowledge. With regard to the assignment at hand, our conceptual knowledge is going to involve grasping a lot of sort of political terminology, right? So like, let's say, government, right? You have to know what that means to be able to do the assignment correctly. So that's conceptual knowledge. The second kind of knowledge is what I'm calling propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge has to do with the idea of sort of accepting or rejecting some claim, okay, which has been proposed to you about something, and which claim you have understood. Okay, so I'll go back to my very mundane example, right? So let's say someone tells you the cat is on the mat, right? Now you've understood what that means, so you have a conception of it, right? But now in addition to that, you might say, yes, I know that in the sense that I accept it. Or you might say, no, that's not true, I reject it. Okay? Whichever one happens to be the case, that further sort of mental act of accepting or rejecting that statement of the cat being on the mat is what I'm calling propositional knowledge. Okay? So this involves something more than just understanding that, you know, the cat is on the mat. It also involves believing that to be the case. You believe that that is so, or you believe that that's not so. Okay, so it's a further mental act than just understanding. Okay, this is propositional knowledge. All that you know, you can sort out into one of these two categories. Okay, try it, test it yourselves. Nothing falls outside of these categories, right? So whatever it is that you know, it will be some piece of propositional knowledge, or it will be some piece of conceptual knowledge. Okay, now this is very important to understand because it really helps with clarity in writing and in especially in persuasive writing when you're trying to make the case for something. It can sort of help you avoid a lot of messiness in your thinking. Okay, so note that, and let me now give you some examples of the two from the readings that you're going to do. Okay, so examples specific to the assignment. So here's an example of conception, or some examples. That is to say, the conception of key terms and claims that we're going to come across in the reading, right? So, like federalism, right? What is federalism? We need to clearly define it before we do anything else. Or anti-federalism, right? The opposite position. Or ratification, for example, that's a term we're going to come across. What is that? Or a constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth, right? These are key terms in this debate, in the writings of this period, and if we're going to analyze these writings, we gotta have a good grasp of the meanings of these terms, right? Good. Okay. What about examples of propositional knowledge? Well, that is going to be some of the key claims that the actors in this debate are going to make. So, for example, the anti-federalists are going to say something like, centralizing power is harmful to individual liberties, right? That's a certain statement which you got to understand. And in addition to that, right, you're going to have to agree with it or disagree with it. You're either going to have to say, yes, that's the case, or you're going to have to say, no, that's not the case. Okay? And that's going to be an act of propositional knowledge. Okay? And then once you do that, you're going to have to be able to evaluate the claim, right? In terms of the evidence that the author offers for it. So you always have to keep these things in mind, right? What here is the author saying that I gotta conceive, properly understand? What claim is he making? What proposition is he putting forth, in other words? And then finally, what's the evidence that he gives for that proposition, right? Whether he says it's true or it's not, right? And this, you'll notice, will help you go a long way in clarifying your own particular take on the readings. Okay, so that's enough about that. If anyone has any questions about these two terms, conceptual knowledge and proposition knowledge, we can take those up after this session. But let's move on now to some context setting, which is going to be helpful for analyzing the primary text that you're going to read from the authors, specifically the anti-federalist authors. Okay, so here's some historical and intellectual background to these readings that you'll do, right? I've listed about 4, right? There are a few more, but I think just 4 that sort of immediately came to mind will suffice for now. The first is the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so before the U.S. Constitution, the Articles of Confederation established there were a bunch of articles that established a loose configuration of sovereign states with a weak central government. Okay, and they had issues such as economic instability or lack of enforcement powers and difficulties in foreign diplomacy, right? That kind of led many people to push for reforms. Okay, and then the anti-federalists in particular often saw these articles as flawed, right? But they still preferred to sort of keep them and amend them rather than just replace them entirely with something like what the Federalists wanted to do, namely, a more centralized government. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation, keep that in mind. The second is the Constitutional Convention of 1787, right? So this constitution was drafted in secrecy in Philadelphia to address some perceived failures of the Articles of Confederation that I just mentioned. And certain anti-federalist critics argued that, the new constitution was, you could say, inconsistent with the spirit of the American Revolution, okay? Because it wanted to create a government that was very centralized and potentially problematic in a way we'll see later. Okay, so they had an issue with this constitution from a number of perspectives. The third historical intellectual background pertains to some sort of philosophical assumptions of the parties to the debate, right? So there are several that I could mention, but I'll just limit myself to one, namely this idea of natural rights. So the Federalists the Anti-Federalists were big on this idea of natural rights. Arguably, it might have been a sort of tenet of their deism, which is a kind of theological position, right? Which I won't get into for the purpose of this lesson, but maybe we can do that later. The Anti-Federalists believed in protecting individual and state rights, and especially the individual rights, which they believed were natural in some divinely given sense. And they thought that, the Constitution sort of failed to address them, right? And it was a significant concern of theirs. So a lot of their motivation came from preserving these natural rights, which they thought that sort of a central government wouldn't be able to do. Okay, so that has to be kept in mind too, as a kind of intellectual background. And then finally there was the ratification process, which, as some of you might know, required approval by 9 of the 13 states at the time, leading to, again, heated public debates through pamphlets and letters and speeches, 2 of which we're going to read for this assignment, right? For example, one of the authors that you're going to be reading for this assignment, namely the author of the Federal Farmers, right? His letters were aimed at persuading state legislators and the public to reject or demand significant amendments to the Constitution. Okay, so that's important background as well to keep in mind when thinking about the sorts of things that he says and some of the motivations behind why he says what he says. Another idea that I forgot to mention, which is connected with this third point, the philosophical foundations, is this idea of republicanism, right? Which is a certain system of governance, right, that sort of emphasizes small, localized government and active citizen participation, right? Which the anti-federalist authors who shared this ideal of republicanism feared would be threatened by a central government of the sort that the Federalists pushed. Okay? So that's another important intellectual background factor to keep in mind to this debate. Okay, so that's enough about context setting. If anyone has any question, we could take them up after. Okay, now let's look at some guiding questions that I want to leave you with to think about as you do this assignment. You may find them useful for stimulating some thoughts of your own as you're asked to analyze, either certain passages from the primary texts, or by themselves or in relation to each other. Okay, so these are just some hopefully helpful questions that might prove useful to you. A general one to think about as you're reflecting on the content of the texts is, what are the risks of giving too much power to a central government, right? So if you had to say something on behalf of the anti-federalists, what would you say, and how might that sort of stimulate your analysis of what that historical author says about the question? Okay, and then there are some more specific questions, like which pertain to the readings in particular. Like, for example, how do the anti-federalist concerns reflect fears of tyranny? Right? You'll see this come up, this fear of tyranny in the readings. Another is, do you think their concerns, that is, the concerns of the anti-federalists about representation and individual rights, were valid? Okay? And in connection with that last question, there's also the following one. What assumptions about human nature and government underlie these concerns? I.e., the concerns about individual rights and the like, right? And then finally, how does the author propose addressing these issues, if he does make any proposals? Okay, so hopefully these questions, these guiding questions, can sort of orient you to some extent in your thinking about the context of the content of those primary texts. Okay, and then finally, there's also a reflection and its relation, and the relation of the content of the assignment to a modern context. This is a kind of bonus question which you can do for additional practice and points. Okay, the assignment question I put to you as follows. Okay, and you should do this after having finished the initial assignment and having thought about some of those issues, and now sort of are attempting to apply it to your own context, right? So the question is, which anti-federalist concern do you think is most relevant today, and why? Right? And here I want you to sort of appeal to your own experience, or perhaps the experience of others, someone that you know, and to assess and write about.